All right, session 2. Welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We had a great morning session. We've got a great afternoon session coming up as well. This is session 2 of 3. And this is called Places for People. All across the world, cities are investing in signature projects, sometimes new spaces, but often existing places that have sat dormant for decades. The driving theme in these projects is creating a place for people, as we heard this morning. Places where people want to live, visit, and simply enjoy at the pace of life. In today's session, we're going to be drawing some inspiration from great places and great concepts. We're going to get ready for a whirlwind trip around the world. But of course, for any whirlwind trip around the world, there's no better place to start than right here at home, and that's where we're going to start today. One of the places that we in Halifax here are currently reimagining is the Cogswell Interchange. Cogswell is right in the midst of being reimagined, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to one of the key driving forces behind that. Her name is Donna Davis. She's our first speaker today. So Donna has been currently the project manager of the Cogswell redevelopment program. Donna's had a long and distinguished career in public service here in the city of Halifax, but like a lot of those overnight successes that kind of just seemed like they burst on the scene after a couple of decades of service, Donna kind of came to our attention in a big way really less than a year ago as designs for Cogswell started becoming public. And Donna is the person that you see at pop-ups. You see her at Scotia Square. She's going around to community pop-ups and heading design charrettes, and it's kind of become synonymous with the Cogswell Interchange project. So we're very excited to have Donna here, and she's going to bring everyone up to speed with what's happening with Cogswell. So please give a big hand to Donna Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Paul's indicated, my name is Donna Davis, and I'm the project manager for the Cogswell redevelopment project. I'm delighted to be here today to provide you with an update on the project, and more importantly, the preliminary results from our recent public engagement initiative, one which focused on the public spaces and design, building design aspects of the project. But before getting into the exciting details from the public engagement sessions, I would like to provide a brief overview of how we got to where we are today, particularly for those who are not that familiar with the project. The Cogswell Interchange includes approximately 22 acres of land immediately north of the downtown of Halifax and east of what is known as the north end of the city. It's bordered by Cornwallis Street in the north and historic properties in the south. The Cogswell Interchange is a visible reminder of an era accompanying post-World War II suburban growth in Halifax, and it was part of a much larger project, Harbour Drive, a multi-lane freeway planned to run along Halifax's waterfront the entire length of the peninsula. Now, the interchange was built during Halifax's urban renewal era and resulted in isolating the north end from the downtown and displacing the area residents, as you can see on the right side of the screen. But it was public concern about the heritage destruction, and in particular the potential destruction of what we know affectionately today as historic properties, that eventually halted the completion of Harbour Drive, but not before the Cogswell Interchange was actually built in the early 1970s. Now today, Cogswell remains as an underutilized single-purpose orphan piece of transportation infrastructure, often described as the road to nowhere. There's been much discussion about its removal actually, and in fact, we've always been talking about tearing it down and replacing it since the first day that it was completed. And interestingly enough, we're not alone in this quest to actually fix or right some of our urban renewal mistakes. We look to Vancouver and their Viaduct project, we look to Montreal and their Bonaventure project, and we also look to Toronto and their Spaghetti Junction in Etobicoke, all very, very similar projects. But the real impetus to do something about the Cogswell Interchange really came in 2009, when the municipality adopted a vision for these lands through its downtown Halifax secondary municipal planning strategy. The vision in that plan states that the dismantling of the Cogswell Interchange will enable the transformation of the area into a coherent and appealing mixed-use precinct that will serve to reconnect the downtown with the north end, providing a compelling northern gateway and accommodate a significant density of office, commercial, and residential uses. It goes on to say that the development of contemporary landmark towers of signature architectural quality will enhance and update the downtown skyline, and that these densities will be supported by a network of pedestrian-scaled blocks framed by high-quality streetscapes and public spaces. And new streets and improved alignments will ensure pedestrian connections to the waterfront and to the north end neighborhoods. Now, the vision statement then goes on to say that we need to develop a Cogswell Interchange area master plan, and that should be undertaken. And in fact, in 2013, that is in fact what happened. When the municipality engaged Acoustics Plan and Design, a local design company, to develop the master plan for this area. Now, input from a significant public engagement session, affectionately known as the Cogswell Shakeup, held in May of 2013 and involving approximately 500 people, served to confirm the direction of the master plan exercise. In May of 2014, our regional council adopted the Cogswell Lands Plan as the area master plan for Cogswell, and the specific objectives endorsed by regional council as part of that plan included that first it should be a walkable and transit-oriented neighborhood, that the densities there should support increased use of transit. It was also a major objective to reconnect the neighborhoods that I talked about, the northern neighborhoods, the areas to the west, to both the downtown and to the waterfront. Thirdly, to reestablish the fine-grained street grid of the downtown that had basically been obliterated by the construction of the interchange, as well as to include well-designed private and public spaces within the new neighborhood. It was proposed that it will be a mixed-use core, residential being a priority, but of course ensuring that we have commercial uses to support that new neighborhood, a neighborhood that may be actually comprised of approximately 2,500 people. Prioritization of active transportation is key, and last but not least, that there should be a renewable energy district as part of the project. So based on these objectives, staff were directed to take that 2014 Cogswell Land Plan and initiate the detailed design, and at 60% return back to Regional Council for a review and sign-off. In essence, we were told to confirm whether the concept plan could be built and to let Council know what the business case looked like. So in June 5th of this year, the 60% concept plan was in fact approved by Regional Council. This is a picture of it here. The plan finalizes the layout of the street network, the relocated and new underground infrastructure, the resulting development blocks, the alignment of active transportation components, and confirmed the placement of parks, the urban square, plazas, and the possibility of including privately owned, publicly accessible spaces, or POPs, within the development. It was explained to Council at that time that the design of the public spaces was still very conceptual and required substantial additional work between 60 and 90%. And similarly, it was explained that the design provisions for new buildings had not yet been tackled. Consequently, part of Council's approval of the design was to request staff to undertake the following: additional engagement through a collaborative process led by staff but involving key stakeholders, the community, and potentially external design experts that will result in recommendations for Council respecting the final district public realm design and detailed land use policy. Regional Council recognized the design of the public realm and the relationship of the public spaces to the buildings and their design are key to truly realizing the vision for the district. To elevate the plan from merely a functional design, showing where things are going to be located and essentially how big they are, to the all-important elements of design, regarding how are we actually going to feel here? How can we ensure we're going to enjoy the space? How can we make it fun, lively, and a place where we want to be? They also recognize the consultation should be broad-based, involving citizens from across the municipality. And to help us with this, we engaged Fowler, Bald & Mitchell, a local architectural firm, to develop a robust engagement plan and carry it out in conjunction with ourselves and our urban design company, WSP, based in Toronto. One of the things FBM are well known for is the engagement process that was used in the design of this great building that we're sitting in today. Now, also as part of the process, we became quite excited about the opportunity to collaborate with the Downtown Halifax Business Association and stakeholders on what we're calling the GEL initiative. And we're delighted to have GEL, a renowned urban design firm, play a constructive role in helping us to complete the 90% plan. I now want to spend the rest of the time that I have with you sharing with you the details of the engagement process, but more importantly, some of the exciting ideas that have surfaced from the session. Now, the engagement took place over the last 3 months, starting in August and lasting until October, and a variety of activities were involved in that process. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but I do want to highlight a couple. The first one being focus groups. I'm really excited and very proud of the fact that a component of the engagement involved talking to a number of underrepresented groups within the community, within this neighborhood. the African Nova Scotian community, the Mi'kmaq community, and Shelter Nova Scotia. And those were really insightful and interesting conversations. And it was clear that the Mi'kmaq community and the African Nova Scotian community are in fact very interested in this project. They're also very interested in seeing a presence in this project. And so those decisions are ongoing, or discussions are ongoing, and we're really excited about where that may take us. I was also excited about the fact that we undertook a design charrette, a 4-day design charrette. I had not been involved in one before, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. All of our sessions were sold out, and between 30 and 50 people came together in the various sessions and worked really diligently, and a large number of them stayed the whole entire time, and Peter in the front row here is actually one of those. But in terms of the total interactions through this engagement process, there was well over 1,500 forms of interaction, whether it be online, in person, or whatever, through this process. We also included, thanks to FBM, and I wish we had done this a couple of years ago, developed a 3D model, which was a very effective tool in terms of helping to explain the design to date and to engage the public in terms of the public spaces that we're talking about and the building design discussions. In terms of the charrette itself, it consisted of 6 sessions, 5 of which deal with the public spaces that need further designing within the development, and one of the sessions dealt with starting to delve into the ideas around the urban design and the building designs themselves. In terms of the public space opportunities, following in Ethan's presentation, we not only have 10 great opportunities, we actually have 11 great opportunities within Cogswell. And I just want to go through those very quickly with you. So starting here in the bottom end of the eastern boundary of the project, this is the Barrington Greenway, where we're taking back 9 meters of the traveled way of the street and converting it to public space, bi-directional bikeway, separated sidewalk, and set within 2 boulevarded sets of boulevarded street trees. Which is really exciting. A similar design for the Cogswell Greenway, which extends from the Barrington Greenway up to Brunswick Street, and has the potential of actually continuing on to the Halifax Commons. Connections to the waterfront are really important. We've identified 4 major potential connections, and maybe even 5, which were subject to conversation. A multi-use trail that borders the western part of the project boundary, starts in the north here, continues along, follows the Cogswell Greenway, comes through the Transit Plaza, and then into this significant urban square known as Granville Square and Ordnance Plaza. And of course, that is a major urban square green space that is flanking the southern part of the development. Another pocket park, which we had lots of conversation about, is located in the midpoint of the project. And then, of course, the green space park known as Poplar Park in the northern part of the project. Sidewalks throughout the entire development were up for conversation. Are they wide enough? Are they interesting enough? Do they facilitate public gathering? Do they facilitate strong public interest? Similarly, lots of diverse conversation around POPs and whether or not we should have them or not, and last but not least, the gateways. Both of the roundabouts, which are part of the street network, serve as placemaking gateways, and of course we have a gateway entrance on Cogswell Street itself. So in terms of the process, we took those 11 opportunities for creating great public spaces. We worked in table sessions. We used that base map. Ideas were generated at all of the tables. There was reporting back. Those were then consolidated at the end of each of those sessions. And that occurred over a very intensive 2-day period, including working into the evenings. And then the following day, we basically had an expo for gathering additional feedback on all of those ideas. So what I'd like to do right now is share with you some of those ideas. In terms of walking, cycling, and transit hub, a lot of people were very excited about the active transportation components within the project. And in terms of the transit hub, there were some great ideas brought forward. Simplifying transit and making it easier to use, was certainly one of the ideas. In the transit hub itself, which is focused on Barrington Street and Bell Street, as you see it there, let's make sure that we have exciting, active building frontages in that particular area. And instead of our buses just spending time and waiting here until they actually start their routes, maybe we actually should remove them and put them up on Albemarle Street, for example, to make that a more effective and efficient transit hub. In all sessions, connecting to the waterfront was really important, and there's a whole variety of ideas that have come forward, both in this session and you'll hear in one of the other sessions, about gateway and wayfinding opportunities to actually bring people from this area and from the neighborhood to the north into the waterfront area. Supporting pedestrian activity and movement through this entire neighborhood was identified as a priority, and in some cases some additional crossings and pedestrian crossings and improving the ones planned were talked about. And of course, connecting the north end to the new neighborhood was an enduring theme, and one of the major directions that was suggested here was that not only should Cogswell Greenway be constructed to Brunswick Street, but there is strong support for the continuation of that greenway and bikeway all the way to the Halifax Commons. There was also discussion about, and this is a major area where we need to do some more thinking about, and that is how can we, with these new street connections, both Proctor and Cornwallis, really facilitate that linkage to the Gottingen Street neighborhood. History and commemoration, a variety of topics were talked about how in this particular area we could celebrate history and commemoration. We talked about ways to commemorate the story of the urban renewal activity that has gone on here, the freeway plan itself and the fact that it was stopped. These could be conveyed through ideas of, say, the photos of the original neighborhood, keeping a piece of the interchange as a Berlin Wall moment, for example, or even going so far as keeping a large part of the interchange, believe it or not, as an elevated park. Now, as I mentioned, we met with the African Nova Scotian community and have several conversations with the Mi'kmaq community. And again, what was very clear to us and clear to them is that their presence in this area, which they've occupied for a very, very long time, is not known, is not seen. And they see this as a huge opportunity and a really exciting opportunity for them to become involved in making that presence known. So we're pretty excited about that. We also touched on a number of topics of history relating to the water treatment plant itself. Here, we could talk about, the original shoreline of the harbor and of course our military history with D&Ds being so close. And we also discussed a variety of ways in which that commemoration could happen through small and large art projects, civic asset naming, decorative paving, electronic media, and a whole variety of other ideas. In terms of parks and plazas, the highlights of the design directions that we heard were in terms of this major urban square located here in the south part of the project. The design direction for that square is suggested it should reflect the historic character of the neighborhood because it actually borders historic properties. Elements within that square should include trees, spaces for small events and gatherings, spaces to rest, and the provision of perhaps water features. It was also identified that perhaps some spaces, because we are such a maker society, that opportunities for pop-up type of craft venues or even integration of such things in the adjacent building should be considered. It was also identified that Granville Square and Ordnance Square should really be considered as one large urban square, and that we should pay attention to the pavers and to the treatment of the streets in this area and how we actually make that a major safe pedestrian crossing zone to get us from this new urban square down to the waterfront. A lot of discussion around the building that is located directly adjacent to the square and how the design of that needs to basically be appropriate in bulk and scale for that square, what the opportunities are for ground level retail or community uses in that building, and most importantly, that building in and of itself could provide a focal terminus for the historic pedestrian Granville Mall, as shown here. So either the building itself or a cut-through of that building to allow for the adjacent building to provide that terminus. So all great ideas coming forward, and I can say that that's already influencing our discussions around that particular building. The pocket park here in the center has been identified as a great vantage point along the multi-use trail, basically for great views out to the harbor. And some ideas around the northern park, known as Poplar Park, really centered on the idea of community gardens, greenhouses, a naturalized landscape, and maybe educational opportunities there related to ecosystems, the water treatment plant itself, sewage treatment plant I should call it, and the district energy system that's going to be associated with that. Trails, greenways, and the waterfront. Some of the major ideas there were, again, coming back in this session, a lot of conversation about how do we make those connections to the waterfront through wayfinding, maybe some contemporary interpretation of historic gateways, and I think that's a conversation that we need to have and work very quickly with the waterfront people. Recognizing that the east-west movements in this particular area are quite challenging because of the grades, how do we deal with that? And also along the trails and the greenways, have a variety of sensory experiences and activities, such as learning activities, arts and murals, edible landscaping. Streetscape features and gateways. Highlights here, one of the major ideas was that the intersection of Cogswell Street and Barrington Street really came forward as it being the heart of the district. And because of that, we should pay particular attention to the designs of the buildings in those areas, their relationship to the street, perhaps some ideas around some small plazas based on building setbacks, some unique streetscape elements there. Maybe that should even be a scramble intersection. The roundabout here in this location was recognized as a predominant gateway and could be space for a marker or public art. As well, all of the sidewalks and greenways here, a variety of street trees should be provided. I actually have 20 minutes. Gosh. Where over 270 street trees are actually being planned as part of the project. So I just have a couple more slides. Building design. Of all the sessions, this is the one that generated the most amount of interesting dialogue as well as controversial dialogue. Some of the key ideas was that within this area, we really need to pay attention to the surroundings with respect to the designs of the buildings. The southern end should integrate with the heritage nature of that particular part of the development. The center part is an opportunity for lots of interesting articulation and details at the lower ground floors, varying street faces, and active frontages and as well. It was even suggested here that maybe this is the location for an iconic tower design. And in the north, the design should integrate and relate to and blend into the northern part of the development. Other ideas that were discussed, affordable housing, for example, interim uses on the vacant lands. I won't go through the entire list, but there were lots of additional items beyond just the public space conversation that we had. So in fact, there was over 100 ideas provided to us through this process on public spaces, and over 50 ideas provided to us on building design. So the process was very exciting, and we're very pleased with that level of engagement, and we think we can really move forward with that input to ensure that this is a people's plan for this new district. And we're now going to be working with our designer, WSP, as well as GAL, to make sure that we can include as many of these ideas, and we think many of them can be, if not most of them can be, included in the 90% design. So in terms of next steps, and final slide, our goal is now to work towards the completion of the 90% design based on the input we received from the public, take that back to council for their review, and then based on their direction, move forward to engage a constructor and look forward to the demolition and ultimate construction of the new neighborhood. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Donna. I should point out too that at the end of this block of speakers, we're going to have another panel discussion as well. So be thinking about questions you might want to ask, either specifically about Cogswell or more generally about some of the other discussions that we'll be having. And of course, luckily Donna is right here in Halifax. So if you don't get your question to her today, she's around. Okay, so speaker number 2 of this session is Hans Karssenberg. And Hans is coming to us today from Amsterdam. He's the founding partner at Stipo and editor of The City at Eye Level. As a public developer, placemaker, advisor, and trainer, Mr. Karssenberg works to improve cities, streets, and places across the world. Sounds like he'll fit right in here, and I hope he's here somewhere. Here he is. Come on up.
Thank you very much. I think modern day leadership is knowing which networks are out there internationally, learning from them, and then connecting those networks to your own situation. And I've met TJ in Stockholm, and then in Vancouver, and then in Amsterdam. And I think he's one of those modern day leaders bringing us all here today. So that's fantastic. And not only did TJ do that, but the organization also took care that we wouldn't just fly in for this conference from abroad and then say what we had to say, but connect with you guys by doing walks in the city in the past days. So I've met with a great deal of you guys already, and I was really struck with the enormous open mind and the eagerness to be open and learn. And that's a unique quality, I think. And that's probably going to be your best quality to develop Halifax further in the coming decades. To be open, to really learn, to be able to discuss everything. So that open-mindedness has blown me away. Thank you very much for that. So, quick introduction. We run a team called STIPO. It's an interdisciplinary team for urban development. And interdisciplinary for us is that the city is not just to be understood from the point of view of design, urban planning. It's also culture, it's also an economy. So we have, for instance, a psychologist on board of our team, anthropologist, a sociologist, economists. I'm an urban planner myself. There's an urban designer. So we really take this multidisciplinary view on what a city is and what city development is. And we work on co-creating visions with citywide visions with all the stakeholders until through area development, social innovation, until the very place that we're talking about today, the public spaces. And we're very much a value-driven organization because we feel that we should feel the responsibility that the environments we're creating today, we should create them in such a way that the users of those environments will not only appreciate them, be happy in them, and feel at home in them today, but also 30 years from now, but also 200 years from now. I'm really happy to have heard that this is called the 7th-generation thinking this morning. So we have a large obligation, and thinking through what is really sustainable in cities, we have found that the public space is really a tremendous key. There's more, of course, but the quality of public spaces is enormously important. And that's why we set up an international program with so many wonderful partners globally called The City at Eye Level. Now, we chose this title because we find it important to take the view of you and me walking down the street and then experiencing everything we see around us. That's the City at Eye Level idea. So, for instance, a street like this, we can discuss whether this is beautiful architecture or whether it's well maintained or whether there's holes in the road. But I hope we can agree that this is a type of street, and this is Thessaloniki, by the way, in Greece. This is a type of street where you would feel at home in, right? As a pedestrian walking down the street, you would instinctively, intuitively feel at home. So what we try to do with the City at Eye Level is to understand what are the mechanisms behind this. What are the mechanisms behind this first gut feeling or this feeling of the heart that you might have walking down a street like this? And then how can we translate those mechanisms and criteria to our new urban development? Because we want this sort of atmosphere in our new development, right? This is creating an atmosphere that hopefully the users will be happy with 200 years from now. So TJ asked me, could you talk about human scale? And Courage and I and a group of people at this conference, we took a long walk down the peninsula. And well, this is the good part about our profession, right? That we get to walk the streets for our profession and just interact with people all the time. And then there's so many, I had to really, due to time reasons now, I had to limit myself to the amount of pictures I could put into this presentation about the human scale. Halifax is such a wonderful city, and it has such a great human scale in so many places. So the human scale is right in front of you, I would say. And the most important thing you could do is to take your leaders, to take your investors, to take your politicians, to take yourself, and walk down these streets and then have a discussion with each other. Why do we find this a pleasant street to walk in? Why do we appreciate this street? Why do we feel at home? And some streets, talking about placemaking, are even not called streets, but are called place. And it's not only the historic development. Luckily, we could find a great deal of examples of new developments that embrace the same qualities as those historic qualities, but then in a new shape. Because I'm not saying you should only historicize and only build back the density that you've built before the war, because that's virtually impossible, right? You need to find a modern day outing of this feeling. This is quite a huge block, quite a dense block, but at the street level, it has the same feeling as those previous pictures. So this is the secret we need to find. And by the way, I had a great conversation with the developer, Louis, of this building, and he told me that, yeah, we're doing this because we're renting out those buildings, we're keeping them, we're renting them out, and we want the first feeling of a candidate tenant to be, yeah, this is where I feel at home. And then once they start renting, we want them to have the feeling that this is where I want to stay. So again, Joe Minakasi was talking this morning about the economics of these things. There is an economic behind this. And actually yesterday I got to talk with Neil, and Neil turned out to have this map about the relative quality, the relative property value. And then so the red areas have the highest value here in Halifax and in Dartmouth. And I asked him, so what are these areas? And I guess you know the city much better. Of course, you do know the city much better. He said, well, basically everything before the war. Now this is something to really give thought. The reason why something has a relatively higher property price means that there's more demand than supply. Simple economics. That means two things for me as an urban planner. First, it means that we really have to do our best, with the pressure that's on the city to preserve a large chunk of these areas, at least, maybe even all of them. So there is a discussion about preservation. The second thing this means for me as an urban planner is if people do like this type of street and environment to live in, and they pay so much money for it, there's probably not enough of it. It means you have an obligation to build more of it, and to use the pressure on the city, and Halifax is at a tremendous crossroad right now, where the population is growing in the inner city, where there's a large pressure, and that's a major opportunity to create more of these areas. But then the key question is, of course, how can you do it? And how can you prevent this sort of building from happening? Because, and I don't want to per se criticize existing buildings, but what I do want to take out, because this is even a good block. I would say that from a distance this is even a good block, but on the street level, and this is typically what you get nowadays, these flat facades of large glass surfaces, which are not at all like the qualities that we see in these streets. Right? If I go back a little bit. So there's very little variation in this. It's quite sterile. There's very little interaction actually between the inside and the outside. Okay, this one is still vacant. But if you create a facade like this, then this is not really helping to create that quality that is so well loved that people pay for it. This is a major missed opportunity because this building will be here for the next, hopefully, 200 years for the owner. So in case you might be wondering what you're looking at here, this is a retail space. And you can tell because it says twice on the facade. Oh, no, sorry, 4 times. It says 4 times on the facade. But, if you build your facade like this, there's never going to be a shop that will survive here. And shops will feel this, and they will not go into this building. This is a waste of money and a waste of opportunity.
It used to be the Royal Bank.
Okay. So, what are some of the key lessons that we've learned throughout our work with the city at eye level? And we've curated this book that you can download for free because we want everybody to use it. So it's open source. And we haven't written it. The beauty of it, we've written it together with 80 people from all over the world. So this is, again, one of these combined efforts. Well, first, if you look at the sustainability of cities and how cities function through the decades, this is a fantastic studies of Alamo Square in San Francisco. And it's 1899 to 1931 to 1976. It's the same area. And if you just look at those different spaces, you see the buildings change over time. But you also see that the public space is the backbone of this area. Once you've created those public spaces, they will be there virtually forever. So that's how important public space is to your city. Second lesson. When cities talk about public space, they often mean the horizontal surface that they own and manage. So is this public space? But if you take the perspective of the pedestrian, you and me on the street, and us experiencing the environment, this is not public space, then this is public space, including the facades of buildings. And the most important part of the building is then the ground floor space that you see when you walk down the street. So what we say is the ground floor may be only 10% of a building, but it determines 90% of the street experience. So actually with the buildings that you help co-create public space. Third lesson, there's this difference between space and place. And what we see, do you know Maslow's pyramid? This is Maslow's pyramid for the human needs. So as a human being, you first want to have food and have shelter and have a roof over your head and be safe. And once you have those desires taken care of, you will want to develop yourself, be social with other people, etc., etc. Well, what we do with public space is that the city tends to take care of only the first 2 layers, right, of this pyramid of Maslow. So the public space is clean, it's safe, it's whole, but it's not necessarily a place where you want to be, where you feel at home, where you feel inspired. So that's where the place-making idea comes in, and that's something that the cities can't do alone. That's why what we need everybody for. That's a co-created process. And then the fourth lesson we take out of the book is that when we talk about the quality of public space, it's not only the hardware, the design, the way we design it. And very often if a space doesn't function, a city will have the reaction to have a new design made and then to hope that everything will be good afterwards. And very often that's not how it works out. So it's very much first about understanding what we call the software, the things to do, the uses and the activities, the daily activities that people engage in. But then a third angle of this triangle is the orgware. How is it organized? What are the organizing mechanisms behind it? And I wanted to use the rest of my talk mostly to talk about that, because I think we're kind of all aware that we want human scale in our cities. And we're kind of all aware that we want quality public spaces, but so often we don't get it. And why don't we get it so often? What are the driving mechanisms behind that? Well, I could mention very many, but I would like to focus on a couple. Before I do that, just quickly on, because we need to understand then how do we experience the space around us. So how do we see? We look like a frog. Did you know that? Because a frog gave us our eyes through evolution. And if you put a still standing object in front of a frog, they will not see it, because their eyes are only capable of watching movement. If a fly flies by, a frog has to catch it, right? That's how you survive. We have the same eyes, but we can still see still standing objects because we have developed tiny muscles making our eyeballs tremble. But still, our eyes are much more drawn to movement than to still standing objects. Now, what does that mean for our streets? If you make your streets like this, with boring facades, horizontally organized, disappearing into the horizon, these are the streets where we interview people, and they walk faster, they feel they're in a hurry, they don't feel at home, they don't turn their heads around. This is actually research done by young Gale. And if you have a street like this, we can still debate whether this is a good quality street, but there's a lot of variation, a lot of things happening, a lot of movement. When you walk down the street, every 5 meters there's a new color, a new reason to go in and out, a new scent coming out of the shop. This type of street, people will walk slower, feel more at home more, and this caters for our eyes more. So we can actually count the amount of units that you have on a street, and the great streets on the left, in Amsterdam, they have an average of 20 units for every 100 meters. So every 4 meters, there's a new unit with a reason for you to go in and out. Can be a shop, can be a restaurant, can be a cafe, can be a house as well. And the bad streets in the middle, those tend to have one door every 200 meters, large office blocks with one revolving door, and nothing much happening in the interaction with the street. And this is the research by Gale. Then, how do we listen? Because half of what you experience in public space, and you may not be aware of this, I sure wasn't until I met this guy who called himself an urban acoustic, profession exists, is that, are you aware that the half of what you experience on the street is not what you see, it's what you hear, but it's much more subconscious. So if we create facades like this is when you're moving house, and you took away the carpet, and you took away the curtains and the furniture, and you hear this echo in your house. It doesn't feel like your home anymore, right? This is how we're treating our cities. So if you have an environment like this has a lot of what the urban acoustic calls sound dispersers, like you would have in a studio or in a good concert hall. Here, you will be able to, there will be traffic along the road, and you'll still be able to have a good conversation, one person to the other, without having to raise your voice. So it's about the sound quality. Then there's this interesting notion of the city should be incomplete. We were talking about this morning, because if a city is incomplete, then it invites the users of the city to co-create the city, the urban environment, and to have a sense of mental ownership over the own environment. This is what people like. Now, who are the architects in the room? Who of you guys are architects and designers? Did you ever get an assignment to create a building that is incomplete? Or who are the developers? Did you ever commission an architect to make a building that is incomplete? So what does that mean? Well, it means, for instance, that if you, as a city, allowed the residents to take out the first tile from the facade and to create a small garden there, which is an official policy that the city of Amsterdam uses, then the residents are responsible for the growth of their plants there, and the neighbors will actually start to compete for who has the most beautiful facade garden in their street. And then the street is co-created, is incomplete, and becomes much more human. So, what are the mechanisms working against us? Well, first of all, there's a lack of awareness and a lack of rules. But the rules are out there. So if you want to use them, just download the book, download the work of young Gale, download the work of PPS. It's all online. So there's not a lack of knowledge to use in your own city. Just take that three-dimensional perspective. Don't think that public space is only the two-dimensional space. It includes the facades of buildings. It includes everything you see when you walk down the street. But this is a fairly easy one. Now, this is a fundamental one, because we are often working in placemaking, and very often we get asked at the very end of the process. We've done all the bits of planning, and then at the very end of the process we think, we need the area to be alive, let's do some placemaking. Now there's this saying of putting the cart before the horse. Do you guys use that as well? I love that in the Netherlands. Huh? So we share that saying. This is putting the cart before the horse. And of course, it's fantastic to have hammocks here. This is the most photographed place in the waterfront, I think, right now, probably. So people love these types of places, but it's not enough just to think that that is placemaking. Placemaking is creating great places that people will be happy with 200 years from now. So I'm a little bit of a planning nerd. I dove into all the stages of the planning phase. And from the very earliest stage, you already need to start thinking about the human scale. So where you have a general area vision to where you have the master plan. Who are the urban planners in the room, like me? We can have a session afterwards and go through these one by one, if you like. To the urban design, then to the tender. How you tender is very important. I will just give one example, brief example after this. Building designs, public space designs. So there's so much you need to do to achieve human scale at the end of the line, rather than just asking at the end of the process, let's do some placemaking, people. Of course, there's the mechanism of the short-term profit of the developer, that just for whom it's cheaper. He will sell the building, and it's cheaper to build a parking garage on the ground floor rather than to invest into a great ground floor space like this. And this is one of the key opponents that we have nowadays, is the standardization in the construction process. You need to be aware of that, because if you don't, then you can't address it in the planning process. So you tend to have these sterile developments that basically could be anywhere in the world. This could be in Amsterdam, this could be in Kuala Lumpur. Actually, it's in Vancouver. So, for instance, what we did to deal with this, in Utrecht, in an urban design, next to the central station, we said, let's not have the typical one block, one developer, one tender, one developer, one architect type of development, because it tends to lead to these long, boring facades. But let's break up an urban block into smaller tenders. So what you see here is that there's large volumes to be tendered, but there's also small townhouses to be tendered. These will be private investors who will be part of the urban block and who will create a lot of diversity in the streetscape, a type of diversity that you will never get when you do this one block, one developer type of development. Then it comes down to the management, because great public spaces you don't develop overnight. They are created layer by layer over the course of decades. So you need mechanisms to keep working on the quality and keep improving the quality of these public spaces. So this is a project that we've been working on in Rotterdam, Schouwburgplein. It was ranked the ugliest square in the world by Project for Public Spaces, so we're really proud of that. Actually, it rains in the Netherlands, and somebody thought it was wise enough to put iron on the floor. So when it rains, you slip and break your hip. So we got the cultural institutions to work in a coalition together, to each chip in, and then to launch on a placemaking process. Now we knew that we wouldn't have the money to change the square physically from the start. That's going to be our long-term dream, but we can activate the square in the meantime. So we had these guys who came along. They have the flying grass carpet. So they put the carpet down, and now we have small pockets and places in the area. And on a warm day, you will count up to 80 groups of different people sitting down there. Whereas previously, nobody would use the space. It would be a void. So good management. Great places not created top-down. They're a game between bottom-up and top-down. So for instance, this place in Rotterdam that we were working on, we ran into this chef who said, from the neighborhood, he said, I want to work on healthy food for the less privileged kids. And by the way, I also collect trains. And we thought he would, midlife crisis, still playing with trains. But he actually meant trains. So you can see that this is the chef, right? And he proposed, he had a former East German restoration wagon and 40 other trains. We still don't know today where he keeps them. And he asked, can I put my train in this terrible space and then have a restaurant and then employ the kids from the neighborhood, the unemployed kids from the neighborhood? And then he started growing his vegetables and herbs in the garden in front of it, and he turned the space into a place. Now, there's no way in a master plan that I could have written this down, even if I would have wanted to. So this you only create if you have a process and a game between the bottom up and the top down, right? And then lastly, and there's so much more we could talk about, but time is limited, there's this idea of this bird's eye view design. This is typically the kind of way that designers could present their design to you, but we're not birds. So I started to get annoyed by this sort of designs. Actually, I want to walk past the building and have that experience, and I want a designer to have that experience. So how could we do that? So we ran into the Technical University Delft, and now we're working with virtual reality to walk past the designs of the future buildings. And that will change the way that designers, developers, politicians will view the building. And we don't use the VR at the end of the line to sell the project, which is done often, but we use it at the beginning of the project to prototype and to find out what brings human scale to this project. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Hans. So moving right along, we're going to travel now to Stockholm, and I think it's part of our project charter of Art City Building. We always have to have somebody from Sweden speak. So today it's Martin Arfalk, who's a landscape architect, urban designer, and a founder of Mandaworks. Mr. Arfalk has over a decade of design experience in Swedish and international contexts, and has participated in several award-winning projects. He's regularly invited to teach and give lectures at design schools in Europe, North America, and China. And from 2012 to 2016, he was leading the Advanced Design Studio, Sustainable Urban Dynamics, within the Master's Program of Sustainable Urban Design at the School of Architecture in Lund, Sweden, my old job. Please welcome Martin.
It's fantastic to be here in Halifax. I am really a great admirer of this event, of the people who stand behind it, and I'm so proud to be one of the guys that have the ability to stand here and present to you thoughts that I have, visions we work with in the office. So I'll give you a 20-minute walk through my head, and I try to show you and explain to you thoughts we have about public space in this world. So, everything is connected. The space has its floor. This is the public space. It has walls. That's the buildings, the landscape, etc. And it has a ceiling. We should never forget it has a ceiling. This is the climate. This is the weather. This is making the condition of the public space. So, a hand with its fingers holding the pens, the color of life. These are, by the way, my hands 15 years ago. As Ethan said, we share our public spaces. We shape our public spaces. Thereafter, public spaces shape us. So what we need to do is quite clear. We need to prevent making bad spaces for ourselves because that we wouldn't like. We need the good spaces because those we can live in. Hans also mentioned this. It has been mentioned many times today, and we saw it in the diagram. A public space isn't just a flat surface of a street. It's made up by the walls, etc. It's three-dimensional. And in our office, Mandaworks, we think of that we build spaces when we do planning. So in the process of planning and design, we can address how these companions, the buildings on the side, can and should act to support the wishes of the spaces. So we don't stop by talking about the spaces, we continue and we talk about what builds the space, the walls and the ceiling. Because we need to understand what the purpose is of the public space. What is it that we want to do? What is it that we want the public space to achieve and do for us? How much sunlight do we want to have on this public space? how little of winds do we want to have going through this space? And what do we want to happen on the sides of this space? Together they make the image of the world that we envision in the projects that we work on. So, as architects of our cities, we need to identify the spaces that we want to happen. This means that we need to look at the measurements, we need to understand how people would like to use them, we need to understand the programming of the spaces and its surroundings. We need to understand the layers of the cities, and as much as we think of the future, we need to understand the history. This is very important, and it was brought up about Cogswell earlier today. How important it is when we move forward to also understand the history. Because if we do this, we can bring out what we call the hidden layers. The layers that we don't know of or have forgotten about, but that can give us a lot of asset to the design of the public space. This is a design of a new canal that we brought forward due to a history of use of water and the two sides becoming a public space. And this is how we like to work in our projects, to bring in the narrative, the story, from the empty paper to the vision of the future. Because this is very important, to understand the meaning and why things are the way they are, or the way we want them to be. So we connect by making connections through streets, spaces in the city. And together this makes up a family of public spaces. And the public spaces, they set the tone for the possibilities of this new neighborhood, because these are open houses that invite people to take care and to take part of the city. And as I said, the walls, we need to work with the walls. We need to push down and we need to pull up the buildings. We need to work with the heights, the programming, the density, and the effects of this. A tall building gives more shadow. Can we push this building down a bit to pull it up somewhere else? Can we move programs around to actually focus them around the important public spaces? Because not every street, not every corner of a city is important. So we need to find the balance on where we create the most life. This is one of the projects we work on in Stockholm. It's called the Royal Seaport. In the work that we do, we deal with three types of public spaces. And I'll show you a quick example of each of these ones. So one is about the creation of a public life, a public space in an existing situation. The second one is where we reimagine a space maybe that has been lost. And the third one, which is the one we work the most with, it's the new space, the new city, the new part of a city that doesn't have what we now are imagining. So we take a boat or a plane over to Iceland. This is one of the projects we work on now. So this is about creating a public life in existing space. There's an old bus terminal that sits here. The bus terminal has been transformed into a very popular food court, functioning as a meeting place for the neighborhood. Anyone waiting for the bus will pop in. We have identified this, and we understand it, and we love it. It's a potential to build further on. So, we give a support to this bus station, this new food market. And by doing this, we understand this space and the basic foundation of the new energy that has arisen here. And by following this, we also get the people here, the people behind the food court, the developers, the city itself, to come along with us. We're all happy together. We compose the space by dragging apart the new functions. We activate the spaces by creating a framework. and we introduce protected public spaces. Because after all, this is Iceland. It's +4 in the winter and it's +11 in the summer. And it rains a lot. And again, this is about the climate. And people don't use a public space, a green park, the way on Iceland as you do here or as you would do in Southern Europe. But they use public spaces. And we believe by giving them an alternative of the green open park, this is attracting people. So going from this empty area today, we envision a public space where you can't tell what is inside and what is outside, where the program moves in and out, and this is together with the municipality. So when working on this space, we also looked at the scale of it, because the scale of a space says very much about the function that you want to have and the feeling as a person you want to achieve. And many times when we have open spaces, we talk about how can we bring down the scale? How can we make it human? How can we make people feel home and safe? Many times with big historical squares, we have a massive program on the side, restaurants, bars, and many other things. In this case, we didn't have that. So this gave us the reason to move the buildings into the square and compose smaller units between the buildings. Because we think that the space is a private and a public space combined where people want to feel home. The second project is a bit of a disappointment. We were part of a final this year in this competition and we didn't succeed, but I still wanted to show you this project. And I think it also has a connection to your project here in Halifax, because this is a situation very much based on the modernistic idea of transportation, and now the city of Montreal is dealing with this. So in the idea to connect the two sides of this river bed of transportation, we invented what we call the ring. The ring was a bridge made out of two arms, one to be very efficient, the one to bring people from one side to the other, and the other one to be a pleasant route. And most important, it was bringing in bikers to cross this space. Because in the brief of the competition, nobody thought of how to bring bikers across this space. And coming from Stockholm and seeing the changes and the attitude towards biking, where the city cannot find enough space now for the amount of people that want to bike, and this is in a city where everything goes up or down, nothing is flat. We think bikers are so important. So that became the second arm, and together forming the iconic bridge. This is something we also have to think of when we think of public spaces and how to identify qualities and the memory in people's heads about the spaces. That's the iconic side of it too. So creating the idea for a large space in people's mind, Halifax demands a good landing, a strong relationship to history, a new innovative function, a proud and bold design. And, most of all, it has to have a link with the local community and its users. And in this particular competition, we were also asked to envision a design of how to commemorate the lives of 9 throughout history important Canadian women. And this again links back to Cogswell and the idea of linking back to history. And what can you do with this? You could place 9 statues, or as what we did, we developed the idea of transferring the history of their lives into spaces related to their functions, design, or meaning to each of them. This approach was a way to create multiple spaces with their own identity, all within the one coherent design, present to some, hidden to some others, but it gives us a knowledge to history through spaces. So this is what it looks like today, and this is what we thought it could have looked like in the future. The third example, the intervention of space, is a journey what we call the Space Odyssey. When we talk about the three-dimensional space, and we start out saying it's a box, it can be any shape, but we start out saying it's a box. It gives us a starting point of understanding that this box has to have a certain measurement. It needs to be big enough to be able to function to whatever we want it to do. And this is a box becoming squeezed in at the top. Now why? Because there are other programs that need to be added, and the people coming in on the street need the space enough on the lower bottom. So what we want to do here is we want to adapt it to become. And it becomes a space of possibilities where it can meet other programs such as housing, becoming two sides of quality, one very exposed, that's the housing with balconies, getting the sunlight, possibility for growing on your balcony, and it creates the protected space. And together they could coexist together. So thinking of this, and if we would give ourselves an exercise in urban planning, always saying that when we work, we have to do it hand in hand, space and building. That puts a lot of new possibilities to us, because you're not going to let one hand go if it's a good friend of yours. So the space will inform the buildings, and the building can inform and support the spaces, along with the program you add to the buildings, etc. So in this research project, we developed all these kind of volumes of spaces, and they're all related to the sizes that were needed. Anything from an outdoor cinema to the space a tree needs for a number of benches or a public transport hub, etc. And we matched them with the density of program that we needed to fulfill. And in the end, we were able to give the city back the same amount of buildings they proposed, but with a lot more public spaces, because we moved them together and let them inform each other. So again, space and buildings in coexistence. To get from A to B can be done in various ways. Everyone knows this. And however, one place and one experience can happen at the very beginning or at the very end, we believe it's much funnier and a much better city if it happens along the way. In any good city planning and in a good existing city, those two things can, of course, live next to each other. We tried this in one other competition that we worked on. We were a bit more successful here. We were actually the winners of. This is in a city in Finland, Vasa. And just to show you, the very kind of direct answer to building out the city here would be to fill out a grid system, to sort of continue on the existence of the city. Out of the 60 proposals, when we came up with this idea, we thought, well, everyone is going to do this. Out of the 60 proposals and we were the selected winner, I found out later that about 55 other proposals, they went the whole other direction. People tried to build islands, they tried all different shapes, anything to kind of break away from the existing city and the grid that was already there, an historical grid. So we took this, very simply, we took this grid and we prolonged it into the area, because this is connecting the new area with its context, with its history, and not making another suburban situation. Within the plan, we added all these streets and social alleys and small ways to break down the scale of the blocks, to allow for different typologies of housing, so that you would have your social alley where you meet your friends and you can play on the street. But within one block, a great difference of typologies also to allow for different ways of living. And then the key to the twist of the project that we added, that goes back to this diagram of the straight arms and the curved one. Because by adding this intervention of what we call the diagonals and connect the district with surrounding very important spots, such as the school, the sports stadium, the hospital, etc., we put the new area within a context. We open up the doors for others to go in, walk in, to be part of the city district, and of course the city district to reach out to the surrounding functions. So we simply cut the blocks and we created strong passages through the urban fabric. The meeting point between the grid and the diagonals became public spaces, or corners as we call them. So spaces along the way. I'm sorry, but this is a bird's eye perspective. I, however, fully agree. You don't get away with a design from a bird's eye perspective, but it's a good image to be part of your story with other images as well. Now we go really down between the buildings. We are driven by the idea to do better, right? In order to do so, we need to understand when we did good and when we do good, and what is it that we could do better. We very often talk about how we learn and how we move forward and we will do things better. But many times we need to look back and understand what we did great. So the idea of how to build cities isn't a linear development. It takes loops. It goes in right direction, in wrong direction, and it takes many turns. So I think we have to have this awareness. We have to be aware of that we constantly make mistakes. And we talk about this in the office, that we all need to allow to make mistakes, because by making mistakes, we create success. And throughout the development of urban planning, we also tend to forget. Therefore, again, it's very important to go back in time and to look at what we have and what we've done. This is, by the way, a 1,000-year-old street in Corleone on Sicily. This is Amsterdam, last autumn. This is an image that makes us happy, for sure. This is a place made space, I call it. It's gone. It was only there for an evening. It's gone. It happened because a group of people took initiative. They built this bathtub, they put it out, and they asked people to join in, and many did. Maybe many had a few Heineken before, but they joined in. This isn't, again, what Hans showed, this isn't what the city from above can plan. This is a great initiative, and a city needs to provide for the spaces and these initiatives. This is, to me, very much about tolerance. And we see this in the political changes throughout the world, even in Sweden happening, that we lose the idea of tolerance. And how can we build a city for people if we're not tolerant? This means that we all have to break some rules and do this every now and then. And the city and we as planners, we need to understand that this can happen. We even need to push for it to happen. As a designer, a planner, and an architect, we are team members in actively shaping our cities. And using our imagination is the sharpest tool. So I would say, let's fantasy play an important part in the design of our cities. So this is the last project, a few slides, with a question on where are spaces to be found in our city. This is the city street as we know it. In any city throughout the world, we've gone through this period of giving transportation of cars space enough, as we have always thought, to go through our cities. We know that we're also looking at this at this time, where we hope to shift the idea of that cars are the dominant and the most important figure in the city, but others are. So we turn around, we say that people and bikers, etc., are the priority in our cities. And I think everyone agrees to it, and we know of this. And the consequence of this is, of course, that we give more space to people on the sidewalks or on the bike lanes, which is excellent. It's easier to bike through the city, it goes faster, you get broader sidewalks, so you can do more shopping, you can have a coffee, you can actually stand and talk to your friend, and you can plant more trees. It's all excellent. Well, you can take it one step further, though, we think, because again, our lives aren't only about getting from A to B the fastest way. Living and moving around in the city is much more about your friend, the meeting of a person, your shopping, you're going to work, and many of these things that aren't about the most efficient way of acting. And if you start to look at older cities and how you would have shops across the street where you would go and buy the cheese and then you go across the street to buy your bread, etc., and understand that the street itself is made out of sequences, places itself, then we also get a different eye to our streets in the cities. And this can push us as developers, planners, architects to think of how buildings can help this to happen by pulling back the buildings, by allowing spaces to happen, and to let people actually cross the space and let the cars wait. This makes it also possible to connect the streets and the places with its surrounding, its context. So in the end, if we start to think across the streets, we can let the places take over. And again, we don't build for cars, we build for people in the cities. Thank you.
TJ just said, keep it quick. Okay, we're on to our final speaker, Julia Day, and Julia's here. It's a bit of a circuitous route that's brought her here today, and an excellent one. A bit about building legacy. Jan Gale was at Dalhousie a couple of years ago, received an honorary degree. From that begat Andreas Roll, also from Gale, coming over and talking at our Carmichael lecture. That begat Maki Kawaguchi, who's here again today, who spoke last year. And now Gale's engaged in a very exciting project with Cogswell. We've got a full day of meetings tomorrow. But now we've got our fourth speaker from Gale over the past couple of years, Julia Day. And Julia is working on the Cogswell project, as we said, and she's going to inspire us with some ideas from New York and around the world. So please welcome Julia.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to finally meet you in person. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm not sure if everyone was here this morning, but I was really inspired by Indy Johar's presentation, and we heard a lot about the importance of democratizing the city, not just by voting, but if anybody here lives in the US, please vote next week. It's very important. But by really creating new systems that allow us to help people unleash their full potential. And I love this sentiment because I actually got into this work in a circuitous way. I started doing voter organizing when I lived in Missouri in the middle of the US. It's a swing state. And by doing that work, I got really interested in public spaces, and that's what led me into this world, and the belief that our public spaces can really become democratic platforms from which we can engage people in the city-making process. So my question for you today to think about is, what does that actually look like in Halifax? What do democratic public spaces look like, and how could we work to create them in places like the Cogswell district? So, as Paul said, I'm with Gale. We are a mission-driven company, and we work to make cities for and with people. We have worked all over the world to do this, with 350 cities. We've got to get Halifax up on this map. And we're an urban design and research consultancy, which means that we've got an interdisciplinary staff with social scientists, as well as architects, landscape architects, planners, working together to study life in cities, what people actually do, how they walk around, and how that relates to form. Our work takes the shape of a lot of different shapes, different scales. We do public life, public space strategies, citywide scale. We did this for New York City in 2007, helped define the strategy that led to these changes along Broadway that Ethan Kent talked a lot about. We work on a smaller scale too to redesign public spaces. This was a shared street in Brighton, England, their first ever, that we worked with them to create. Cars are actually allowed on the street. They go 10 miles per hour. We do master planning frameworks. We develop creative engagement processes to help cities figure out how they can involve people in the planning process. And we design pilot projects as a way to activate public space and test out ideas and engage people in what's happening. This is porch swings at Philadelphia's main train station. So, as some of you know, we were founded on the research of Jan Gehl, research he started doing over 50 years ago to understand what is really going on at ground level and what makes a great place tick. This research has been published in a number of books and is really at the foundation of our practice, but our firm wasn't founded until 2000, and it was a co-founding with him and Helle Soholt, our current CEO. And Copenhagen is still where our main office is, and we really use the city as a laboratory. So if anyone has been there in the past few years, I mean, it's really an example of how you can put people first in the city. That we have incredible bike lanes there, great public spaces, sidewalks now have trampolines, there's play equipment built everywhere. It's easier to bike than to drive. But it wasn't always this way, and this is a photo from 1962 where cars were overtaking the city, as they were in a lot of our North American cities as well. And it was a real concerted effort by the city to say, we're going to change course, and we're going to start by iterating and measuring and studying what people do in public space, how they move, and slowly reclaim space. And it has been a continuous effort, and our firm has been involved with this counting and studying and figuring out how we can create more space for people. So now we work in 3 different cities. We've got a team of 70. And we do this work because we really believe that design matters. I think Ethan had one of these photos too, but design can lead us to do unsafe and idiosyncratic things, like jaywalk, sit on uncomfortable objects if we're desperate for a seat, but also really joyful, spontaneous things. This is a snowball fight that happened the first winter that Times Square was open to people. And as I think a number of presenters have pointed out, this is not something that any of us could have designed for, a snowball fight among hundreds of strangers. But because the platform had been created, people were invited to make this space their own and actually interact with each other. Despite this, this is too often still the case. We don't actually look at how people use space. We forget about their needs in the traditional planning process. It's still very building and form driven. So we really believe that any planning and design process has to start with this eye-level perspective that, again, we've heard a lot about. This isn't just about looking at what we can see. It's thinking about, as a pedestrian, what do you hear? What do you smell? Where do you feel comfortable? How much stimulation are you experiencing when you walk down the street? So really, what this presentation is going to be about is how we should all go back to school, study biology and physiology, and then we'll be done. We'll fix our cities that way. That's a joke. We don't have to do that. It's actually not that complicated. Our cities for many years were built with this in mind. We need one stimulation every 4 seconds when we look at historic street grid, historic buildings. This is often the case. You see this all over Barrington Street, downtown Halifax. But you also see a lot of this all over our cities. Fine materials, but places that don't actually allow for any nuance. They don't respond to what we actually need as pedestrians. They don't let us find shade when we're hot, find sun when we're cold, just basic human needs that are often neglected in our environments. The fact that we are pretty lazy and we like things to be really convenient and easy to access. Did anyone see Black Panther? It was very popular in the US, but this is an image from Wakanda, the futuristic utopian city in the movie. And we thought it was funny in our office that it actually touches on all of these human scale dimensions that we're trying to promote in city design. And we often look back to the past. We find pictures of Halifax from the early 1900s. Probably looked like this too, but we found it refreshing to see that maybe this is our future as well. And we really believe that we have to think about people's needs and their sensory experience if we want to not just make nice places, but also achieve healthy and equitable outcomes. And for us, this really starts by looking at public life and understand, what do people do, what do they want to do? It's very simple. And this it changes depending on the climate we're in, the cultures that are around us, but it's anything that people are doing in the public spaces outside of our buildings. It's civic, it's organized, it's informal, it can be commerce-based. It's about community spaces, places for families to gather. It's about being quiet, but also finding entertainment, being with other people, having those random, spontaneous events, and doing what you love, actually using public space to have a good time, but also recognizing how important these spaces are for our everyday needs, for commuting and those things we just have to do, the necessary activities. And we focus on this because there are real, tangible benefits to public life in our cities. We have better health outcomes, environmental outcomes, the list goes on. I feel, we have talked a lot about this today. And when we actually start with people and allow form to follow, great places result. Copenhagen, before and after, 45 years of a strategy to do this. In Melbourne, we've worked for years with the city there to reclaim their laneways and alleyways and turn them into pedestrian-oriented places. This can happen in a much less formal way as well. In Washington, D.C., we worked with a number of community groups to design bus stops in places where people were already waiting and creating informal seating, and how can you formalize that and make the experience more comfortable? It's about looking at desire lines and designing based on those, improving connectivity, and iterating. And Ethan showed some pictures of how Times Square started with lawn chairs put on the pavement that changed to movable tables and chairs, and then 10 years later, an actual build-out. So, as Donna mentioned, Gail has been hired to do a review of the current Cogswell design, and we're not going to share any of our preliminary thoughts on that, but wanted to provoke some thought about what this area could really become. So, as you all know, there's a lot of challenges to the district. Little space for people, lots of truck traffic, a lot of different needs to accommodate. But tomorrow, we're really looking at an area that could become a clear northern gateway into the city and a walkable destination and place. So, and as challenging as the area is, it's a huge opportunity. I don't think anybody's contesting that. And one of the things that really has stuck out to me about this area is that the second it was built, it sounds like there was a realization it was a mistake. And I think we have a real opportunity now to think about how do we plan for today and for today's needs, but also think about what will happen in 10 years when this is actually built out. What is our city going to look like? Are we going to use trucks the same way? Is the port going to be in the same place? So we have to think about addressing today's needs as well as being flexible and able to iterate as our cities change. So what we're really looking at when we look at this design is how we can move from a car-oriented to a people-focused place, from something completely nondescript to a real destination, and something that really connects both people and places together. And we are going to be looking at, what would, and we want to hear from you as well, what would those people-first targets look like in the Cogswell district? What is the vision for life and the experiences that we want to have there that can drive this? And another thing I was struck by in Indy's presentation earlier was this challenge to really think about what is the societal challenge that we as planners and designers can really tackle. And public spaces cannot solve all of our problems. There are much larger systemic issues at hand. But when we have an opportunity like this, what are some of the community needs that a public space, when we zoom in, can really touch on? I'm going to share a few examples of what our work looks like in practice and provide some inspiration to this area. So one is a project in Lille, France. Gail won a competition with a group of technical partners to redesign and develop a master plan for this 57-acre site, a former goods yard. Nothing happening there right now on the periphery of the city, with ambitions to become a residential area for 5,000, very mixed use. This is where it is in the city. So we started by developing a plan and a vision that really defined what are the values here and what is the life that we want to create. After this, we developed a strategy to collect data. As you saw from the maps, there aren't a lot of people, there's nobody living there right now, but this area was adjacent to many communities, so we collected data on what people did in them, what people wanted. From there, we were able to develop designs that could respond to those needs, and then figure out how those designs can shape the long-term plan as well as be tested out in the short term. And engagement ran throughout that process. So some key takeaways for us in this process, which is ongoing, is the value of engaging early and often. And not just engaging in public forums and by asking people to respond to designs, which is important, but also giving them opportunities to interact with the site, to make things, to develop their own ideas, and really figure out ways not just to solicit that input, but to incorporate it into our plans. The second is to be a good neighbor. I think this is clear that a lot of these things are already being thought about here, but to really think about how do we connect socially, physically to the spaces around us, and what's happening in those spaces, and what's missing, and how can we make sure that this new development actually complements the needs we're seeing. The third is to develop a long-term vision and really have a clear sense of what we're going for, but then at the same time have short-term and interim actions that we can test and use to activate the site, get people there, start to change perception of what's happening, and most importantly, study and see how are people using it, how are they responding to these designs, are we on the right track, where do we need to refine and go back to the drawing board. It's also important to diversify the building type and think about how you can integrate and respond to the existing city while also having a range of heights, different building types, a range of access. A lot of times, in cities around the country where we're working, we see, everybody wants mixed use. This is great. This is different than it was in the planning world 15 years ago. But a lot of times, that mixed use doesn't actually lead to a variety or a range of building shapes and forms, and that's essential as well. And this can, we can achieve the same densities that we can with single towers or single form buildings in many different varieties, like courtyard buildings, higher buildings on the corners. The last point is about a hierarchy of public space. And I think another thing we often see is this sort of prioritization of quantity over quality, and this desire to just say, oh, great, we're going to make 50% of the project open space. We need open space, and that's important, But if those spaces aren't clearly defined and articulated, they can often be underused and inaccessible to people. So in this plan, we really spend a lot of time defining what are these zones, what are the complementary areas that we need. A citywide destination is going to be an Olympic pool, but then we need the smaller neighborhood spaces, the streets where kids can play with their neighbors. We need the links to the neighborhood. We need places for commercial food and beverage. Sounds pretty simple when we think about what works in a city. Downtown Halifax does a lot of this really well, but it can, unless we're really intentional with it and define these things from the outset, it's easy to overlook them in the design process. So these are what some of those spaces will look like. Okay. Another example is about how we can really use pilot projects to iterate, to activate a site, and to test out ideas. So Gail did a project in Lexington, Kentucky a few years ago. We did a public space, public life plan for the entire downtown area. And one of the key findings for us was that there was very few children spending time in public space, although a much higher percent live in the city. But where we did see children was in places they shouldn't be. So Lexington is a southern city, and it gets really hot there, and we happened to be there in the summer, and we always saw kids playing in this fountain, and there were signs everywhere that said no swimming, dangerous. Their parents were with them, they were trying to keep them safe, but they didn't have anywhere else to play. There are public pools in the city, they're hard to get to, you have to pay to get into them. If you have 5 kids, entry for all of them is really expensive. So we saw this happening in this fountain here, just on the periphery of downtown. The box above shows a neighborhood park less than a block away that was completely empty all of the time. So we thought, okay, how can we actually respond to this need and use this park to make an amenity that the community needs? And then at the same time, how can we use this to understand how play, especially around a water feature, may foster social cohesion and actually bring people from the 4 surrounding neighborhoods around this space together? This diagram shows the income ranges of the neighborhoods all within a 10-minute walk of this park. A huge disparity, average incomes ranging from $20,000 to $70,000. Disparity in education level and also in the race, black and white particularly living in this neighborhood. So with that census data as our baseline, we wanted to see how might this project actually foster social connectivity. This is what it looked like. It was done as a pilot, built with temporary materials to last the season in partnership with the city, a local foundation, the university, a number of community partners. And we built it with the city, and then we also measured and evaluated it. So some of the key findings was that it made this area become a neighborhood's hotspot. People were visiting much more than they had before on a weekly basis. From hardly ever going there to saying 70% were there once a week. And people were recognizing each other and meeting new people. 1 in 3 people said that they saw a familiar face. And somebody talked earlier about loneliness and that challenge in cities, and I think that's increasingly comes up in our work. And whether you are interacting with someone, but you don't have to talk to them to interact with them. Just being in the same space as other people is good for our mental health. It also became a citywide destination. People felt incredibly positive about this space and started to make it their own. There was movable seating provided, but people began to bring their own chairs, do placemaking projects there. And then it also activated the existing park and playground that was there that had been completely underused. But by activating this lawn area, the rest of the park started to see more investment and more love. And luckily, the play in the fountain went down. You can see in that yellow line, and skyrocketed in the park. So again, people just saying how much they felt they were meeting their neighbors, coming together. When we looked at who was there in terms of demographics, we saw more income diversity and education diversity, although still disproportionate representation of higher income residents. But this was only up for 2 months, so it was a start, and it's something that the city, they didn't reinstall it this year, but they're using it to figure out if they should put a permanent splash pad into this park, and then these methods they can continue using and testing in other projects. So, one last project is, as some of you may know, this Cogswell District planning initiative, it's a huge initiative, huge opportunity, and could take years to build out. So we wanted to share another example of how interim activation can be used in a site. Similar to Splash Jam, this project was used to put a place on people's mental map, show it's no longer a place for cars, this is actually somewhere you can come and spend time. And then also test out what works and constantly monitor and see how people use a space, what they actually need. So in San Francisco, the San Francisco Giants won the right to develop a surface parking lot across the street from their stadium. This is on the waterfront and had been surface parking, really wasn't on people's radar as a place to spend time, but the Giants wanted to turn it into a mixed-use residential development. Again, it was going to take years for this to happen, so where to start? And they wanted to just get people there. So we helped them make a concept plan for how they could activate it in the short term. And they had these 3 distinct goals about recreation, commerce, and culture that fortunately all nest together really well in a public space activation project. And again, they wanted to do this, put this area on the map, so there was a whole communications branding component to this, and figure out how they could prototype and test. This was some of the marketing that was done to let people know what was happening. This is the site plan. A range of activities were designed for different types of day, different demographics, different ages, and some took the shape of beer gardens, using not quite temporary materials, but things that could be done inexpensively, tested out, things could be moved around. You didn't have to buy something to come there. There were a lot of different activities to engage in, and there was also room for programming and events for kids. So again, as we think about how does this land in Halifax and in Cogswell, and what is the public life that we want to see in this new district? And how can we start activating the site and inviting people to spend time there from all across the city in the short term? Lastly, just as a joke, what is the date while you wait in Cogswell? This is from the New York City subway. Somebody sets this up while you're waiting for the subway. You can play Connect 4 and flirt with somebody, perhaps. But what is the version of this on the scale of the Cogswell district? Thank you.
I'm going to ask our speakers from this session to come up and join me up here for a brief panel discussion. Everybody's always shy with the first question, so I do have a backup one, but I want to give time for people that are here waiting patiently. So who has the first question? Down for you, back here. And we had to do the furthest one away from the microphone.
Maybe I can yell. Because I love microphones. Well, it seems like the topic is Cogswell. I was involved in the 2014 plan, and Since then, our drawing sort of stepped aside. We haven't been involved in the ongoing conversations and the process since. It's interesting to see what's happened since with the public engagement and then the charrettes that have happened with other design professionals and some peer review, I guess. What I'm seeing is that what we had proposed back then, it has been confirmed, and especially related to the public spaces, the locations of the key public spaces, the parks, the bikeways, the streetscape, the key streetscapes and all that. As part of our plan, we were working under basically the project had to be, we'll call it, cost neutral. So everything had to pay for itself. So the sale of the parcels, everything would then pay to create these really great public spaces. I'm a landscape architect. I'm obviously very biased towards creating parks and plazas and great public spaces. I'm curious where the process is on, especially with the buildings and the pro forma on buildings, and how economically that's going to play out, and how these great park spaces are going to be paid for. Whether it happen when the site opens in a few years, or if it's over time, just where we stand.
Okay, so it sounds like a Donna question on the specifics. So maybe a more general question is how do you make the argument that more investment in public spaces which don't pay for themselves immediately can really be sold politically?
Yes, that's a great question. So where to start? So when we went to council in June, we went with the 60% plan. We didn't go with the direction or the premise that it had to pay for itself. The plan was evolving, and we worked on the design. We took the plan back to council. We also took the business case back to council. It just so happens that based on the plan that you see today, a large part of the revenues generated from the buildings based on the design assumptions of the buildings do in fact pay for the project. But it became very clear in that meeting that we did not receive direction from council that says that this must absolutely pay for itself. In fact, I think the mayor is on record as having said that. So we went into the design charrette and the public engagement sessions with that full knowledge. In fact, I wish I had $1 for every time I actually had to make that statement, that staff were not given any clear direction saying it absolutely must pay for itself. In fact, the business case we presented didn't quite pay for itself. It was within 6%. But fair enough. It's an expensive project, will be an expensive project, and so there will be some magic number that neither the council nor the public will support in terms of moving forward. But it was not a hindrance and not a factor, and we made it abundantly clear in the design. So that's where we're going. It is intended that the design that you see and the parks that you see and the open spaces and the bikes and bikeways and all of that would be actually developed as part of the initial construction. And so that's really exciting. Depending on the detailed design, we may have guesstimated correctly in terms of what those parks are going to cost, or it may be a bit more. And so our intention then will be to go back to council to say, okay, we had these 10 really great ideas. The existing budget or proposed budget you saw back in June says this, but you know what? For X more, we can do this. And so it's meant to lay all of that out for council when we take the design back.
Can I add 2 notes on to that, maybe?
Because I think this is a very important question to address, discuss and research. One of the notions is that I think the walkway by the water is one of the most important features to think of, and relate that to the shadows cast by the buildings. So it would be very interesting to study the shade in different times of the year and how it affects the waterway. And then very often we find that density is mistaken for high-rise. So I really like the graphs that you were showing, Julia. There's all sorts of different types of building shapes that you can take and still reach density and work on the business case for project as well, without necessarily having to do highways.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, yeah.
Great, next question. We've only got time for a couple, so you've got to take your time, right? Mr. Greenland.
Another question on the call as well. I hear a lot of groups, a lot of people expressing concern about the scale and size of the streets. It's great we have Gail working on the public spaces, but Gail is one of the world-leading firms on streets. My question is, what would it take to press pause and say, wait, we need to make sure that we are getting these streets right? Because if we screw that up, nothing else will fix this project. And looking at it, I'm nervous that we're going to get rid of the overpass, but we won't get rid of the highway.
Again, I assume that's a question for me. And again, I think it's a really great question. It's one of the most controversial and challenging parts of the design. So I guess what I want to start off by saying is that if you look at what we have there today, we have a highway infrastructure. The major step that we're taking forward with the design plan is basically we're moving from from highway standards to what we consider basically urban design streets. So while the plan may not convey it, Barrington Street, for example, is going from 5 to 6 lanes wide to 4. Now, not everybody agrees that it should be 4, but we are basically taking back 9 meters of space and giving it over to active transportation and the creation of the greenway. What is left is 4 lanes of traffic, and those laneways are actually being designed to the smallest standard possible and meet best practices. So the middle lanes are 3 meters wide, and the curb lanes are 3.6. And those are guided by the size of our buses. If we had smaller buses, we'd have smaller curb lanes. The number of lanes, because we don't know everything, and the points that have been made by all of my colleagues here today is that the plan that we're moving forward with is not the perfect plan, and it will evolve. And I think that's what we need to do, is look at the Cogswell plan as an evolution and make sure that the first step that we're taking is a good one and moving in the right direction. And I think going from 6 lanes down to 4 and building an urban-sized street is a good one, and giving a large part of the right-of-way over to active transportation is important. But we have questions about the future of transit priority. We have questions about parking. We have questions about a whole variety of other things. What is going to happen with the truck traffic? I will say, and I like to be on record as saying that the volume of trucks that are going through the Cogswell project did not significantly influence the design of the street network as it is today. Truck traffic is 4.7% of the total volume of traffic. What has influenced it is 93% of the volume, and significant numbers are moving through there and coming into our downtown on a daily basis. So the way that we've looked at it is we're taking this first major quantum step to reduce the streets down and turn them into urban street standards, regain a lot of that back for ATM public spaces, but allowing for the evolution of those streets over time. So if we don't develop a comprehensive plan around rapid transit, and we don't need the 2 additional lanes on Barrington Street, well then they can become a wider part of the greenway. There are things and unknowns that we don't know about, and so we're talking about this plan being an evolutionary plan, and we think that taking this first step with that design, in fact, achieves that. Not everybody agrees with that. They think that we should take a step further. If we make the travel way too small and don't account for some of the future uses or even uses that we don't even know about, it's going to be difficult to take that back.
Yeah, this was exactly my question as well. We've been talking about this as well, because it feels as if the project is very much determined by the traffic engineering at the moment, and then that drives the possible size of the urban blocks, and that's the reverse, that's putting the carriage before the horse, in my feeling. So I would really hope that the politicians would want to make a decision about the project, because it's a very important project. It needs to move forward, but in a way that it will not limit the future options for this plan, but it will keep some options open. And I think you really need to research different street patterns here as well. That's what my feeling would be as an outsider just visiting this city 2 days now.
And I'll just say from Gail, we are in the very beginning of our design review.
movie. We have a day tomorrow reserved to see the site, spend time with Donna and the city and stakeholders and talk more about this. And I think we're also looking at a number of spaces between the buildings that right now are potentially labeled as privately enclosed spaces, but they are on the table. Perhaps those could be something else that improves east-west connectivity. So connectivity will be a big part of our review.
I just wanted to clarify that the number of lanes in the intersections in the current plan are 5 or 6, and that's the place where it's actually most critical that people can get from one side to the other. So something I'm going.
One right at front. It was sort of a theme that a number of your talks here were the idea of a bottom-up approach. Encouraging small can be good. That we want to see more development that is being driven by local people sensing local opportunity. So I'm just wondering if you have any further thoughts on what you've seen as successful in that regard. How can you encourage more people to see themselves as developers, see themselves as being able to insert themselves into that civic conversation and build places that they want to see themselves in, and also their neighbors. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I think the system of planning is different in different countries. In Sweden, the municipality has the monopoly. This means that every plan, if it's on initiative from the developer or the city itself, it goes through the city. So if the city wants to bring people into the planning and want to take part of the planning, I think one thing that they can do is actually to allow to sort of not plan every part of a block or a city district, but allow it for resting and waiting until there is a need or there is a wish to develop it. So phasing is tremendously important, I think, in any urban development, because there's not really one good example where development has happened in a short time once, but the best examples have happened over a longer time. And you can see initiatives also in Germany. It's very, very popular in Denmark, and it's coming to Sweden in quite a great deal, is that the municipality actually give away plots to private people to develop their own buildings. It's a community of people, maybe not even architects, but that get the finance together and they build a 4-story building with apartments for themselves, and they sell it or they live there. And it's a way to actually get this greater mix into the blocks that we talked about very many times today. So I think there are many ways to do it.
It's a great question, and I think one thing that we see is more and more everybody wants to do engagement, which is great, but how you do it is really important. And there are still a lot of engagement processes that don't actually, that probably reach just 3% of the public. And I've heard that if you reach 3%, that's actually really good. It's hard to engage people, and I think we're constantly thinking about what are more creative ways of doing that. One thing, we've been involved with 2 different projects I wanted to share. One was called the Play Everywhere Challenge that was open to Canada and the US, but it was mostly in the US, run by a national play advocacy group, and they provided funding to 50 community organizations that wanted to design and build temporary play structures that could be put in non-traditional play areas for the US, like sidewalks, bus stops, laundromats, places that could improve access to play, particularly in communities with low incomes. So that's one way of, I think, involving people, allowing them to bring their own initiative, providing funding for them to do, and then we also worked with this organization to measure the outcomes so that they could see which ideas could be scaled up. Another project was in San Francisco called the Market Street Prototyping Festival, and Market Street is one of the main downtown streets in San Francisco. There's a lot of thought being put into how to make it a livelier, really become a public space, not just a transportation corridor.
And the prototyping festival invited makers in San Francisco to design interventions that could be put onto the streets. So again, people won a competition, they got funding to actually build this. So I think these types of projects are a great way for engaging the non-usual suspects, people who've got ideas, really can test things out, and then if designed as part of a larger strategy, can become actions that are helping you get to the longer term goal.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. The big times of science flashing like you folks had.
Just one maybe on this question, that there's a difference in my view between participation and active co-creation, even consultation, of course. So at this stage, I would really debate, following Martin, who is going to do the development of all the blocks. Is it going to be the typical one block, one developer type of development? Then I'm afraid this would be not the type of project that you would want to have. Or can you split up the blocks into larger and smaller volumes to be developed and create much more diversity and variety of who is doing the development?
That's great. Obviously, we could talk about this for a much longer time. We have to get set up for our next session of speakers. So please stick around. You might be able to approach our guests individually. And I heard Jones, you need to check your emails. So let's give another big hand for